God sent his Son, they called him Jesus. He came to love, heal and forgive. He lived and died to buy my pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. How sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and joy he gives. But greater still, the calm assurance this child can face uncertain days because he lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives. And then one day I'll cross the river, I'll fight life's final war with pain. And then as death gives way to victory, I'll see the lights of glory, and I'll know he lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future, and life is worth the living just because he lives.
I was reminded quite recently of the poem by William Blake. The words have been set to music, and we know them today in the song Jerusalem, the song that begins, "And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's pastures green?" I used to sing that song at school many years ago, sing it with perhaps a great deal of enthusiasm, but with little understanding of its meaning. It wasn't until much later that I came to realize that Blake was something of a mystic, something of a visionary, and that in that song he was alluding to an ancient tradition, an obscure tradition, that says that in the silent years between the age of 12 and the commencement of his ministry at about 30, Jesus Christ came to Britain. Now, I am not concerning myself this evening with the tradition itself. I'm simply remembering the last words of the verse, "And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills?" It's surprising, isn't it, how a phrase or a word can sometimes set off a whole train of memories. Well, That's what those words did for me, those dark satanic mills, because I was born and brought up among those dark satanic mills. They were the cotton mills of Lancashire, the dark, smoky north of England, where because of the dampness, the raw cotton brought in from Egypt and perhaps from the southern United States was spun into thread and woven into cotton cloth. I can well remember as a boy in the 1920s growing up in a street in one of those towns, a street of red brick terraced houses. And I can remember, too, being awakened in the early hours of the morning by the sound of clogs, the clogs of the women, clip-clop, as they went down the cobble street to the mill. Sometimes, in winter, I would get up and rub the frost off the inside of my bedroom window and look down on these men and women going off to work. Mostly, I used to lie in bed and just listen to the sound of the clogs on the street outside. Now, there didn't seem to be anything special about those men and women, but they were weavers, and as weavers they were proud followers of a skill that dated back to Egyptian times. Furthermore, a skill that is often alluded to in the Bible. In the book of Job, chapter 7, verse 6, Job said, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle." And the book of Job is one of the oldest books in the Bible. Then again, in the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 38 and verse 10, King Hezekiah speaks about God cutting off his life like a weaver cuts off the thrum, the loose threads, when the work is completed. And in the book of Exodus, chapter 35, verses 30 to 35, we read of two men who had developed weaving to a very fine art and were commissioned to weave beautiful curtains for the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. That curtain is described as being of fine twined linen and blue and purple and scarlet with cherubim, the work of a skillful weaver. Now, there always seems to me to be an analogy to be drawn between the making of a curtain like that and the lives that we live, in the sense that every day of our lives we are weaving the fabric of our life that will one day be spread out for God's inspection. You know, there are really two main philosophies of life by which people live. First of all, there's the philosophy that says that the circumstances make the man. The philosophy that says you are what you are because you've been shaped that way by the forces of upbringing and environment and birth. And then there's the other view, the more positive view that some people take, that says that the man makes the circumstances, that you may so fashion and shape your circumstances that out of them something good may come. Now, the first theory says that what you finally make of your life is not a question of your will or your work, but is determined by factors outside of your control. The second theory says that your effort is the most important factor, and that you may rise above circumstances, and, given the will and the application, you may make something of real value from your life. Let me suggest that we come very close to the truth if we think of our lives as being rather like that curtain that God commanded Moses to have woven for the tabernacle, the curtain of fine twined linen and blue and scarlet and purple, with the interwoven figures of the cherubim. I very clearly remember the times when, as a boy, I went along to the mill and saw the weavers at work with those massive looms that rattled and roared so loudly. My mother was a weaver, you see, and I used to watch them setting up a loom in readiness for weaving. Now, perhaps you know, well, I'm sure you know, that in every fabric there are two sets of threads, the warp and the weft, or the warp and the woof, as some people call it. If you've difficult remembering which is which, let me simply remind you that the warp runs up and down and the weft runs across and across. Well, in the fabric of your life there's a warp and a weft. The warp you might call your inherited disposition, your background, the circumstances into which you were born, the conditions that were presented to you when you came into the world. Now, anyone who knows anything at all about those cotton mills in Lancashire knows that the warp is something outside of the weaver's choice. The warp is brought to the weaver on a huge roller, a roller that is placed upon the loom, and when the loom is started up, the weaver has to make the best of the warp as it unrolls. Now, it may be a good warp, that is to say, easy to work, but it could be a bad one, too, which means difficult to work, so that the weaver doesn't get on very quickly. I well remember my mother coming home when I was a boy and commenting that it had been a bad week because she'd had a bad warp. This happened more than once. It had given a whole week of trouble because the threads kept snapping and the machine had to be stopped so that the broken threads could be pieced together, and all of this meant loss of time and less work done and a smaller wage at the end of the week. At other times, everything went like a song, and the weaver only had to keep a watchful eye on the loom as the work was done. But if you asked a weaver if he ever had a warp that was absolutely unworkable, he would have told you no, because those bad warps simply called for greater patience and greater skill on the part of the weaver. Now, if you apply this to life, I think you'll see this truth. We're all subject to circumstances to a certain extent. We're presented with the warp of our life, and some people may receive a warp that's easy to work, others may have poor warps. But the case is never absolutely hopeless, because what the final fabric becomes doesn't depend entirely on the warp. It depends just as much on the weft. The weft being the threads that are carried by the shuttle that flies backwards and forwards through the warp, building up the pattern, creating the material. No matter how bad the warp may be, it is possible by skillful weaving and the use of a good weft to produce a fabric that's serviceable and even beautiful. Now, the weft of your life is what you put into it. Your thoughts, your words, your actions, your aspirations, your aims, your hopes, your desires. And these are things that you can control. Because this is the great truth. You may have no control over how or where you come into the world, or what is presented to you when you come, but you can control what you do with your life once you're here. You can so weave into the warp of life that's given to you that the final result is something of which you may be proud. Because, and remember this, God doesn't hold you responsible for how or what you are when you enter the world, but He does hold you responsible for what you are when you leave it. And get hold of this too. Although your inherited circumstances do influence your life, your conduct influences it even more. Never say, well, I can't help being what I am. With my background, I can never be any different. No, because if your warp is a poor one, just take a bit more care with your weaving, and your life may become as beautiful as that curtain for the tabernacle. John Greenleaf Whittier, that great American hymn writer and poet, he wrote some lovely hymns, popular hymns too, one of them, Immortal Love, Forever Full, Forever Flowing Free. He also wrote the words, we shape ourselves the joy or fear of which the coming life is made, and fill our future atmosphere with sunshine or with shade. The tissue of the life to be, we weave with colors all our own, and in the field of destiny we reap as we have sown. Now you see how this man stresses the fact that we're personally responsible for what we make of our lives. He even uses the words of Paul, whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. But what a striking line that is. We weave with colors all our own. It reminds me again of that beautiful curtain for the service of God, and it suggests that we ought to be trying to turn our lives into that kind of beautiful fabric. In that Lancashire cotton mill, if you'd stood by my side as I watched the weavers, you would have seen some looms producing solid colors. Of course, the cloth was serviceable, but you wouldn't call it really beautiful. On the other hand, you would have seen looms being tended by experienced and skillful weavers with as many as 6 different shuttles carrying different colored weft, flashing backwards and forwards through the warp, so that the cloth that was built up, the cloth that was produced, was like that tabernacle curtain, full of warmth and beauty and color. Now, your life can be like that. It ought to be like that, because the fabric of your life is not meant to be drab and gray and dull and colorless, but vibrant and exciting, full of infinite variety and color, pulsating with life. Oh, how greatly some people have misunderstood Christianity when they've suggested that all the color and the brightness and the variety and joy is outside of Christianity, in the world, and that being a Christian is something dreary and dull and dead. Let me tell you that the color of life is seen inside the fellowship of God's people, inside the church, not outside. Think about that curtain that Moses made for the tabernacle. Perhaps you know that, in fact, he was commanded by God to make 4 coverings for the tabernacle framework. Right on the outside, as a protection against the elements, there was a waterproof covering made of badger skins or seal skins or leather. And beneath that, there was a covering made of ram skins dyed red. And then under that, a 3rd covering of goat's hair cloth. And finally, on top of the framework of the tabernacle itself, the innermost curtain was this beautiful curtain of fine twined linen and blue and scarlet and purple, embroidered with the figures of the cherubim. The beauty was only seen by people inside the tabernacle. The eyes of those who stayed outside never saw it. I'm sure you know that tabernacle framework was divided into two parts. The smaller part, called the Holy of Holies, and the larger part called the Holy Place, the part of the tabernacle that represents the church, the place which had the lampstand and the altar of incense and the table of showbread. And those who entered that place, the priests, enjoyed the beauty. The colors were there, the scarlet and the purple and the blue, and as the light of the seven-branched lampstand filled the holy place, it would catch these beautiful colors on either wall and up above on the ceiling, and there would be the glint of the gold of the pillars and the table and the altar of incense, or perhaps even reflected from the golden lampstand itself. Do you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying that God intended that curtain to be a thing of beauty, and viewed from within, everything about the tabernacle was richness and wonder, suggesting that fellowship and worship and service with God and all of life itself is meant to be full of infinite beauty and color. I'm thankful that the days are largely past when Christians thought they served God best by making life dark and colorless. Weave into the fabric of your life the blues and the purples and the scarlets of joy and praise and happiness. And say with the hymn writer, "Oh, use me in my golden time, in my dear joys have part, for thee the glory of my prime, the fullness of my heart." And one last word. Don't forget the cherubim. You meet them first at the entrance of the Garden of Eden, when it had become an exit for Adam and Eve. In Numbers 7 verse 9 we read that God dwelled between the cherubim. When Solomon built the temple, he carved all the interior walls with cherubim. And in the Holy of Holies, that most sacred part of the tabernacle itself, there were cherubim on either side of the mercy seat, that lid of solid gold on the Ark of the Covenant. And the cherubim were carved out of the same piece of solid gold, and they stretched their wings to touch above the mercy seat. They represented God's holiness and God's presence. They represented God's claim upon everything. The only places they're ever seen are near the throne, in the tabernacle, in the temple, in the things that belong to God, the things hallowed and sanctified by the presence of God. So while we're weaving our life stuff of scarlet and blue and purple, let's not forget the cherubim. Notice that they were not stamped on or printed on, not even embroidered on, but woven into the very fabric itself. And into our lives we must weave the emblems of the presence of God. It isn't enough to live a good, honest, moral life, and that's rare enough in these days with falling standards of morality. But a Christian must be a good and pure and faithful and honest person because God is present in his life. Now that's what makes you, if you're a Christian, different from other people. The cherubim woven into your material is the mark of your holiness. It's like the hallmark on a piece of genuine silver. It's like the red thread that runs right through every piece of genuine alpine rope, the climbing rope on which the climber risks his life. Into the very stuff of the life of a Christian must be woven holiness and sanctification and everything for which the symbol of the cherubim stands. We may not be able to attain riches or fame or power or any of those other fleeting things by which the world measures success or greatness. But if day by day and week by week and year by year we weave into our life Christ-like thoughts and words and actions, the final result will certainly be a fabric which God will approve of when it finally is unrolled before him for his judgment. A life's weaving of fine twined linen and scarlet and blue and purple with cherubim, the work of a skillful workman.
All the way my Savior leads me, what have I to ask beside? Can I doubt his tender mercy, who through life has been my guide? Heavenly peace, divinest comfort, here by faith in him to dwell, For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. For I know whate'er befall me, Jesus doeth all things well. All the way my Savior leads me, cheers each winding path I tread, gives me grace for every trial, feeds me with the living bread. Though my weary steps may falter, and my soul athirst may be, gushing from the rock before me, lo, a spring of joy I see. Gushing from the rock before me, lo, a spring of joy I see. All the way my Savior leads me, oh, the fullness of his love. Perfect rest to me is promised in my Father's house above. When my spirit, clothed immortal, wings its flights to realms of day, this my song through endless ages, Jesus led me all the way. This my song through endless ages, Jesus led me all the way. If for the prize we have striven, after our labors are o'er, rest to our souls will be given on the eternal shore. Home of the soul, beautiful home, there we shall rest, never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, he is the light, oft in the storm, lonely are we, sighing for home, longing for thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea, the crystal sea. Yes, a sweet rest is remaining for the true children of God, where there will be no complaining, never a chastening rod. Home of the soul, beautiful home, there we shall rest, never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, he is the light, oft in the storm, lonely are we, sighing for home, longing for thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea, the crystal sea. Soon the bright homeland adorning, we shall behold the glad dawn. Lean on the Lord till the morning, trust till the night has gone. Home of the soul, beautiful home, there we shall rest, never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, he is the light, oft in the storm, lonely are we, sighing for home, longing for thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea, the crystal sea.